All right, next up, I'd like to introduce Mick McGrath. Mick is the Director of DevOps at Bitovi. He has over 8 years of experience leading teams and building web applications at scale and spearheading the development of the open source project BitOps. He has led technology teams for some of the world's biggest companies and has encountered and overcome many of the most complex deployment challenges, including high availability, disaster recovery, and auto scalability for clients like Yum Brands. When he's not directing Bitovi's DevOps operations, Mick enjoys traveling, hiking, and being a father. Mick's going to talk to us today about how to simplify your infrastructure and app deployment configuration with BitOps. Mick, take it away.
Yeah, so let's talk about BitOps. So first we'll talk about like why this tool, what the tool isn't, what specifically it is. We'll go over some features and then go through some examples. So first of all, why BitOps? BitOps. So oftentimes you'll be in, you'll set up your pipelines in, some service, whether it's Jenkins, Circle CI, Travis, things like that. You typically have some YAML file to define what your automation pipelines look like. And if you're not careful, those YAML files can get out of hand. There's, a lot of configuration that you can do in those. You can get pretty locked into any one of those. And if something cheaper or better comes along, shifting is kind of difficult, especially on the deployment side. So also there are a lot of situations we've seen where environment configuration exists in a lot of separate either repositories or branches in the repositories, and it makes it difficult to figure out what is deployed where, or if you want to promote something from one environment to another, then you have merge conflicts you have to resolve and things like that. And then often the infrastructure piece will be defined separately where, I have the configuration to define a virtual machine or a Kubernetes cluster in one repository, whereas your applications that are deployed onto that will exist in other repositories or sets of repositories, and you have to like somehow figure out how to like connect those together, and you get 1,000 tabs syndrome. And then in a lot of cases, a lot of things need to be set up in order to get CD, continuous deployment going. And oftentimes this is through going into a cloud provider or going into some service and clicking buttons. And then if somebody else changes something and you run a deployment and failed, you don't really always have, a historical context of that change. So why did it fail? I don't know, something changed, but we don't know what. And so one thing that I'll point out for what BitOps is not, before I start addressing some of those other concerns, BitOps is not a CI tool. So it's not specifically going to run tests. It's not going to build your artifacts. BitOps focuses on deployments. It is strictly a deployment tool as it exists today. And it is also not a pipeline runner. So BitOps is essentially just a Docker container. It runs within a pipeline. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that and why that's important later. All right, so what is BitOps? BitOps is a deployment tool that helps keep your infrastructure as code organized across multiple tools and environments. So you can define all of your environments and the tools and applications deployed onto that environment all in the same place. So it's essentially a Docker image that understands an operations repo, which is the bulk of the underlying concepts of this talk, to deploy infrastructure and applications onto that infrastructure for any number of environments. So some of the features that it has, excuse me. So some of its features are, again, it's pipeline runner agnostic. You can organize multiple environments, any number of environments. It's highly flexible there. Organize multiple tools per environment, whether it's Terraform to define your infrastructure, or Ansible to populate a VM, or Helm to deploy to Kubernetes, or CloudFormation, and it's pretty flexible to be able to handle really any CLI tool, and that's really not an exaggeration. Like literally any tool that can be run on the command line, BitOps can be upgraded to handle pretty easily. Like I said, you can define your own plugins with CLI tools as config. And then one of the fun features of BitOps is you have hooks for before and after deployment so that you can set things up or tear things down afterwards. As I mentioned, it's pipeline runner agnostic, so a little bit more on that. Whether you're using GitLab, GitHub, CircleCI, Travis, Jenkins, Buddy.works, there's a whole host of these pipeline runners. As long as it can run Docker containers, then it can run BitOps, and you can have an operations repo pattern and run BitOps to do your deployments. You can pretty easily switch around the pipeline config to like have your entry point be the Docker containers is not very different, across each of the different pipeline runners. So it's pretty portable that way. And the core of BitOps is an operations repository. So it's a Git-based repository where root level directories are environments. And I've got a note here for non-underscore prefix because by convention, not by anything coded, things that are prefixed with an underscore are not environments. So you can pretty quickly look at an operations repo and tell exactly what the actual environments are. And then child directories of environment directories are the tool directories. So you'd have, say, environment A, and under there you would have a Terraform directory, a Helm directory, etc. And then you can define all in one operations repo environment or split them up. Like I said, it's a very flexible approach, and I'll show you some examples of how we have everything in one, as well as having things split up into multiple environments. And then some clients we work with, we actually also split up different environments like non-prod and prod into different operations repositories that have consistency and parity between the two, but we separate them out for the configuration change access. So you want maybe everybody can update code or config in the lower environment, but only a certain set of people can do that in the higher environment. So we split that up at the source control level to help manage those permissions. All right, so I'll just show a quick high level here of kind of what the operations repo looks like. I'll show some more in-depth examples, but this kind of shows what you could expect to see in an operations repo. Again, an operations repo is a Git repository where root level environments or root level directories are environments. So in this case, we have production service A and test service A. So we have two environments, production and test. And under each of those environments, we have Helm, CloudFormation, Ansible, etc. And then inside of there, it's going to be essentially whatever that tool is looking for. So everything in here would be the same as if you had a directory somewhere else that you just put all your Ansible code in, or if you have directories somewhere else now that all your Ansible code's in, you can pretty easily put it into an operations repo format and have this nice organizational structure. And then inside of there, you have the additional goodies that BitOps gives you for before and after scripts, and then this BitOps config, which essentially tells that tool's CLI how to work. This is a config-based representation of the Ansible CLI tool, essentially. All right, like I said, hooks are a set of user-defined scripts that run before or after the execution of each tool. There's a directory in the tool directory, so environment A /Helm / before scripts or / after scripts. And those are just bash scripts that you can run whatever you need to in there, and they're run alphanumerically and given just a certain set of environment variables to be executed prior to and after the actual tool. So it'll be before Helm upgrade is called, and then Helm upgrade is called, and after Helm upgrade is called, essentially. And you can provide any scripts that you want to fetch secrets or set up some additional configuration, or for an after script, you can clean things up after a deployment or do some notifications, things like that. Defaults are another really good feature that we utilize a lot. So because you're defining all of your environments, usually those environments are consistent in some way in terms of what's being deployed. Maybe you have an operations repo for like, I don't know, the Hey Emoji app, for example, and you would have multiple environments like dev, QA, prod, and you want there to be consistency, like you want there to be consistency across all of those environments. So maybe you want, Prometheus for monitoring and Grafana for visualizing stuff, and you want the same set of configuration across all of those environments. You can put that in the default, and then BitOps knows how to find the default, and it's configurable. And it will pull in that common configuration so that every environment looks the same, and all you have to specify per environment is the delta between each environment. All right, so let's look at a few examples. I'm not going to go thoroughly in depth about all these. I just want to show sort of the overall structure of what an operations repo looks like. So this is an operations repo called operations recruiting. Typically, we call it just operations dash and then whatever it's actually managing. And in this case, this is a Kubernetes cluster that we're using for our Bitovi's DevOps recruiting tests. And so in this case, we just have one environment, just the recruiting environment. We've got our Terraform. All this is just exactly as you would see it in any Terraform setup. You've got your main TF and modules and things like that in here. And this is to deploy the VPC and the Kubernetes cluster, et cetera. And then we have another directory called Helm. So recruiting/Helm. These are all the things that are deployed onto the recruiting cluster. And so these, I'm not going to get into the configs here because we're limited on time. But the configs here, like I said, are only the things that are different from the default. And so if we go back out here, there's the _default Helm. So all of this Helm configuration would be consistent across any of the environments that we deploy to. Okay, we've got another one just as an example here. This is an example of splitting up an environment into like a deployed infrastructure or set of applications into multiple environment directories in BitOps. There's nothing required from BitOps or an operations repo standpoint that says that everything for a deployed Kubernetes cluster, say, has to be in the same environment directory. So it's pretty flexible. You can kind of mix and match however you need to. So in this case, we have right now 2 environments. We're about to add a third where we have dev tools. This sets up our cluster and all of the monitoring and certificate management and routing and things like that. And then we'll have another environment called dev, which is the actual services deployed onto that same cluster. And so like with a combination of the BitOps config, Terraform passing techniques and secrets management and before scripts, we can make sure that everything's pointing to the same cluster across these, but you can always just see, okay, well, what tools do we have in dev? You can, hop in here and pretty easily see what that looks like. We have global tools that are going to be managed at a higher level that's not specific to any environment and that kind of thing. And then here's just another example where we did a demo with Ops Crews, which is an observability tool. It's a layer on top of your observability layer to help automate visibility. And we were working with them to do a demo, and we had essentially 2 clusters. And this just shows like demo 1 and demo 2 are heavily utilizing this default stuff, where there's very little actual config in demo 1 and demo 2 because they're very similar environments. But I can very easily see, okay, well, what's in demo 1? And then there's demo 1 ops crews. And without much digging, I can very easily see which cluster this is put onto and things like that. So like if I look at the BitOps config, you'll see here's the cluster name that it's being actually deployed to, that kind of thing. If you're interested, BitOps, like we said, is open source. So it's github.com/Bitovi/BitOps. And if you check that out, there are lots of other examples. I'll just kind of show a high level here. There's some Ansible stuff. A lot of these have associated blogs. So you can dig in here. These are directories inside of BitOps, but you would think, you could think about each one of these as you would kind of pull this out if you wanted to start working with it and set it as the root directory of your own GitHub repo. And this would be the root directory of your ops repo. Okay. Upcoming features, I'll just quick highlight. Plugins are going to get better. It'll be a lot easier to define plugins, define and manage plugins, and a plugin will be its own GitHub repository that you'll be able to pull in during your BitOps image build. Right now, everything's Bash in BitOps, where we'll be converting that over to a full programming language like Python or Go or something like that. And then as part of the plugins piece, we'll also support more cloud providers. AWS works pretty well right now. It's been pretty well tested. We've got GCP and Azure kind of on the way, but they're not fully supported yet. All right, and we are hiring. So if you are or know anybody who is an SRE who would fit the bill for an SRE and DevOps consultant, send them over to bitovi.com/jobs.